global updates and future horizons. And so I'm lucky to have a great panel here. We have Jonathan Hernández again. We have online, we have Maria de Brasdefer from IFLA headquarters, who will join us online. We have Lisa Radha Vohra from Toronto Public Library, and we have Michael Nyby with us. And I just have to put in a plug because his school was so nice to have him here today. He is the W. Ross McDonald School for the Blind cataloger? Librarian there. And he's the former chair of the Intellectual Freedom Committee. So we're glad that he's here with us in person, and the other two are here virtually. Please give them all a warm welcome as we start this panel. So I've given them all questions in advance, but I'm going to read them so that you guys know what they are. And then we're going to go through and give all the panelists a chance to answer the first question individually. And then I have some special questions for each one of them. So we're going to start with, from your unique vantage point, what do you see as the single most pressing challenge to intellectual freedom and information integrity right now? And I think we'll start with Jonathan.
Thank you. Thank you. It's, again, good to be here. So this is an interesting question because intellectual freedom and information integrity face a complex web of interconnected threats. However, based on current trends and reports, and I would like to take this opportunity to mention the current IFLA trend report. We released the trend report last year. I think it was in November, if I recall. And it's available on the IFLA website. And this report points the need to explore how libraries can help to rebuild trust when misinformation and disinformation becomes widespread. It also highlights that attacks on scientific consensus undermine public confidence in information, advice, and policy that is based on evidence. So I'm saying this because for me, the most significant and pervasive challenge right now is the proliferation and amplification of dis and misinformation within our increasingly dominant platform society. And I think this is important to highlight because we are living under a platform society that involves platform for every part of our daily basis. So while issues like direct censorship, including library book bans and cybersecurity threats remain critical, the current digital ecosystem driven by social media algorithms and supercharged by generative AI allows false and misleading narratives to spread at unprecedented scale and speed. And of course that this is not only pollutes the information environment and makes discerning truth incredibly difficult, but it also actively erodes trust in information and reliable sources. So as we heard today from the keynote speaker and all day conference, disinformation and misinformation will be the single most challenge for libraries and for society in the coming years.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think we'll alternate with in-person and online, so I'd like to bring Maria up to the conversation next.
Thank you, Joseph, and also good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me here. So I'm really happy to participate and also to give the IFLA perspective on this topic. Because, when talking about intellectual freedom and information integrity, I also have to agree on what Jonathan just mentioned. I think from our side, there's also a lot of concern as we continue to witness a lot of growing pressure on these two topics. And we see a lot of censorship, a lot of book bans, surveillance, but also a lot of policies that criminalize either the access to certain content or to those who provide that content. So of course, and as you know, there's many challenges and many enablers to these issues. But for the sake of time, perhaps I would like to refer to three of them, or at least to the ones that I think require immediate attention. And the first one would be, as I said, I fully agree with what Jonathan just mentioned, because so to start, I think the evidence is that our global information landscape, as we know it today, is very easily manipulated and also very flooded with a lot of disinformation. and now a lot with synthetic information with the use of AI. And so I think from our perspective at IFLA, something that we have really found very hard to deal with is the fact that the cognitive effects of also the impact of this information manipulation are still very hard to quantify. So it's not just the fact that the threat to intellectual freedom and also to information integrity that they pose, but it's also the misunderstanding there is about the extent of the harms of it. And we have heard a lot of anecdotes, for example, from libraries or librarians, particularly from those who have implemented digital literacy projects in their libraries, or from those who work with, for example, teenagers and young adults. And many, if not most of them, they find it really, really complicated and very hard to assess the extent of for information that maybe confirms already existing beliefs, which is why we believe one of the reasons why online discourse is so polarized. So from our side, we see this as a big issue, as I think it can be very hard to tackle something that is still unmeasurable for now. And of course, to that, you have to add the fact that the information landscape is changing very rapidly. So of course, this is a big threat for us. I don't know if I should, do you want me to add the other two factors, or should I give the space to another of the speakers to answer the question as well?
I think we have time. You can add the other two. That'd be great.
Okay, perfect. And so, yeah, like I mentioned, perhaps, and for the sake of time, I thought another topic that I think is also very important for us to mention is, now, added to that, the fact that there is a lot of disinformation in the information landscape. We see also from our side that there is a lot of complexity in holding these platforms accountable for facilitating the exposure to false or manipulated content. And so this is something that I'm sure you're also aware, but we think that there needs to be more platform transparency. A lot of social media and other platforms today, they tend to also amplify a lot of sensationalism or perhaps even polarizing content. And they often do it for commercial gain. So of course, this really undermines the quality of public information space, and it makes it very hard for librarians, I think, and for other people to sort of navigate this issue, and maybe also to teach other people how to navigate these online spaces more critically and safely. And so I think this is also for libraries very hard to tackle, as we often find ourselves working closer with the public rather than with the private sector. But nevertheless, I think there's also a lot of value on forming partnerships with them. And perhaps this can also help advocate for more platform transparency and content in that conversation. And then lastly, I would also, and this is hard because, as I say, I think there are so many challenges, but perhaps to mention a third one, I would like to say, of course, there is a big part of this is the censorship that also maybe comes with the intervention of both either authoritarian state and also non-state actors, which is something that we are experiencing a lot now. And of course, because libraries have been historically defenders of open knowledge, defenders of inclusive access, I think when information integrity is undermined by these actors, I think this really strikes at the very heart of libraries and what libraries exist to protect. I think potential threat in the current landscape. And yeah, just to close on that, I can also say that from my perspective, or from the IFLA perspective, those are the most immediate threats that we consider to intellectual freedom and also to information integrity. And to close, I would also like to add that from our side and also at the policy level, of course, IFLA continues to try and counter these threats in behalf of libraries through advocacy, capacity building, and partnership. Well, in my case in particular, I work with everything that's related to the digital aspects of libraries. So, of course, we try to also continue to advocate in international spaces such as the Internet Governance Forum, the World Summit on the Information Society, and other spaces. We try to follow these trends closely. Like Jonathan mentioned, a lot of them are also written or stated in the trends report, and to see how we can continue to support the library community around the world. And so with this, I would like to close, but I would like to also thank you for the space. And of course, if there are any questions, I'm open to it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Maria. Next, we'll have Michael talk.
And rather than echoing what Jonathan and Maria said about the proliferation of disinformation, which was my original answer, and really how the proliferation of what is generally exclusionary and hateful rhetoric has affected our information landscape, I want to talk a little bit about how that sentiment is taken advantage of by political bodies and used in a discriminatory legislative manner. And we've seen this happen in the U.S. quite a bit very recently. So I want to say that the biggest threat that we have in Canada right now is complacency. Because my experience over the last several years working with the CFLA in collecting data on library censorship efforts, what I have learned from this is that many librarians and library workers in Canada, despite the struggles that they are dealing with in their own libraries, constantly have this refrain of, well, at least it's not as bad as it is in the US. But let me tell you something. What we have learned from this data, fortunately last year I was able to source from the ALA some of their microdata on the challenges that they had. And we were able to put together a chart of challenges per 100,000 capita, reported challenges per 100,000 capita in each country. And in 2023, we had a higher rate of reported challenges in Canadian libraries than they did in the US. It is worse here. And why that is significant is because in Canada, there is a smaller proportion of the population taking part in these activities. They have been far more organized. And because of that, they have been able to influence legislative bodies. And so we get things like the Alberta Education Amendment Act last year that passed in December last year. If you're not aware of this act, is anybody here not aware of this act? Okay, so among other things, how this directly influences libraries, that school libraries, all resources in school curriculum and school libraries in Alberta now must be approved by the Ministry of Education, which in my mind is frankly Orwellian. And then on top of that, there are regulations about whether students can be addressed by their proper pronouns and preferred names without parental permission, which is a very dangerous policy to a lot of students. This is a current act, and it is in force in Alberta right now. There have been some legal challenges against it, but that takes some time. And we also have to remember that we have the notwithstanding clause that the Alberta government will certainly be willing to use if this is struck down by the Supreme Court. So the doomsaying talk that Canadian library workers have had about the United States is happening here at the same time, and it is just as bad or worse here, and we have to recognize that, and we have to make sure that we're advocating to our political bodies to ensure that the situation does not get any worse here. And these things can be cyclical, and looking at the shape of the data over the last year or so, I am a little bit optimistic that we may be getting over the crest of this wave. But I believe that if the reactionary forces that are driving this movement continue to gain traction in our political landscape, this situation is not going to get better. So yes, my answer to that is complacency. Complacency is the biggest risk we have right now.
Thank you. And then finally, we're going to invite Lisa to give her answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph, and thank you to everyone at York University for putting on the forum today. So at Toronto Public Library, I'm responsible for collections and membership services, and recently we've put out our intellectual freedom statement to just further provide transparency on our commitment to intellectual freedom and ensuring that information is accessible in a welcoming and inclusive environment, including the opportunity to freely exchange that information and ideas, even those that are unconventional and popular. I think currently, I feel that the biggest challenge, both to intellectual freedom and information integrity in my role, is everything that everyone has already said too, and the lack of access to some materials, especially for public library patrons, whether that is through limits of licensing, whether that's through the contracts that we have to sign for sustainability for how long we're able to provide access to that content, or how quickly vendors can remove that content that we attempt to provide, or if we're not allowed to buy that content at all. And also, we hear more and more from authors, and through some of the ALA reports that Michael referred to as well, the self-censoring that sometimes publishers are doing, where libraries would be open to purchasing content, but because they don't see a larger market for some content, there is publishing censorship happening where authors aren't even able to get their content published, or it's published in a more sellable way and not in the true integrity freedom and everything that's happening with AI bias and things that Marie mentioned. I think that's a huge challenge, both to our work and practice of intellectual freedom, but also to information integrity and the foundation of the work that all of our libraries do.
Great, thank you. So we're going to return to Jonathan. And the question I have next for you, Jonathan, is from your faith perspective, are you seeing common global patterns in the types of intellectual freedom challenges libraries are facing, or are the issues highly regionalized? And do you have any examples?
Thank you, Joseph. Well, from a faith perspective, this is complex. Faith as an advisory committee to the governing board, as in an international organization like IFLA. Well, at faith, we see both significant common global patterns and distinct regional variation. Libraries worldwide are navigating a challenging landscape shaped by resource limitations, digital complexities, and socio-political pressures. And there are important concerning trends that transcend borders. I mean, that is in my experience during these 2 years as a chair of IFLA FAIFE. There are, I can say that 4 concerning trends that transcend borders. Then the first one is the funding pressures, and this is almost universal. I mean, chronic underfunding, especially severe in many developing nations, limits the ability to build diverse collections. We know that, and of course we discussed this this morning. And it also maintains essential tech infrastructure for digital access and retain adequate staffing. And for example, in political polarized environments, funding has even become a weapon, with threats of budget cuts tied directly to censorship demands over a specific content like LGBTQ+ or race-related materials. And also financial vulnerability inherently weakens a library's ability to resist censorship. And we have seen many examples of this, not only in developing countries, but also in more bigger countries and in other regions like Europe, the States, of course, and many other regions that funding pressures are affecting libraries. As a second threat, I will say that the escalating organized censorship. We're seeing a dramatic global rise in censorship attempts in North America, of course, certainly in European countries also. We have examples from Ireland, we have examples from Swedish, for example, and we have many other examples in Hungary. of course, we have some important issues happening in those countries. And some countries from Latin America and the Caribbean, we have an example from Brazil, and many others attempts to ban books in libraries, especially public libraries and school libraries. So critically, many are now driven by highly organized, often political motivated groups, coordinating campaigns across regions. I mean, this is not only happening that one group is operating just in one country. We have groups operating in many countries. For example, that is happening in Latin America. For example, we have groups operating in Mexico, but also in other countries like Central America. The third aspect will be consistent targeting. And the targets are remarkably consistent, especially in Western democracies. Material featuring LGBTQ identities and experience are overwhelmingly challenged. Books also dealing with race, racism, and social justice are also frequent targets in many countries. I mean, I have an example that in Mexico, books featuring LGBTQ identities are being subject of intense discussion. They are not banned, but they are being discussed, you know, in forums, in being subject of a protest also. And the number 4, which I found very important, and it is also very concerning, is the threats to librarians. Library staff face severe impacts, increased pressure, harassment, online and offline. I have seen the harassment in X now, but former Twitter, how librarians are being targeted not only in many countries. And that happens even in Mexico and in Latin America, for giving their opinion, for defending some books, some ideas, etc. We have also seen personal threats and intimidation. So, however, how these challenges manifest varies significantly. For example, drivers of censorship. In some regions, censorship is primarily state-driven, using tools like internet shutdowns, blocking, and surveillance to control information and suppress dissent. But in other regions, challenges often, as I mentioned, come from organized non-state groups leveraging political pressure and existing policies. So we have these 2 types of driver of censorship, which this what happened during the last 2 years, that we received some reports from many countries facing these 2 examples of censorship. Well, in sum, from a FAIFE perspective, libraries face a complex mix of globally consistent threat, funding, organized censorship targeting specific groups, disinformation, and safety concerns. But the way these threats are enacted and prioritized varies greatly depending on the regional, political, economic, and technological context. Understanding this biggest context is crucial for effective international advocacy and support, which of course is central for IFLA and especially for FAIFE. For example, in FAIFE, we are working now with other library associations to try to make a roadmap to help them, to support them, and basically to inform the global library field what's happening in the world, because there has been many misinformation and disinformation around this threat. So it's important that the global library field knows what is happening in certain countries and how they might impact their library, their daily work, and in general, the information landscape.
Great, thank you. So we'll go back to Maria now. Could you please inform us from IFLA headquarters about the global perspectives on these phenomena and give us an update. I don't know if you had already given us some of that information in your first time you spoke to us, or if you have more information to add at this point, Maria.
Yes, thank you, Joseph. Well, as I said, like from the IFLA perspective, we are trying to put a lot of effort and emphasize a lot of effort in some of the challenges that I mentioned, because despite the fact that there are many, we believe that those really require immediate attention. But also from the IFLA perspective, a theme or where we really see, for example, libraries, really a possibility for libraries to lead the conversation or to step up is, for example, in the ethical and also transparent use of artificial intelligence and algorithmic tools. And maybe this is also going to be a bit of a cliche because everyone's talking a lot about AI now. But in reality, we realize that a lot of libraries are already adopting these systems. Perhaps they're exploring how to integrate either chatbots or cataloging AI-based systems into their daily operations. And even though it really is a hot topic, and so we do believe that both within library service and also in advocacy towards wider digital ecosystems, we believe that libraries have an opportunity there to really lead on that narrative. Of course, libraries, there are many ways in which this can be done. But we believe, for example, it can be done either by developing perhaps or adopting open, explainable and inclusive AI systems. Well, a really obvious one is, for example, training staff, maybe users in AI literacy, which is something that we see libraries are already doing a lot. They really are trying to emphasize how, for example, algorithms can affect access to information. And of course, very important one is also to advocate for regulations that really ensure that AI respects human rights. And especially everything we discuss here in the session about freedom of expression, intellectual freedom, access to knowledge. I think there is really a big space for libraries and from our side, from the side of IFLA to engage in. And that also ensures that libraries in a way remain leading that conversation, even as technology transforms that information landscape that, as we see, is changing very, very rapidly. So I think that's, from our perspective, that's what we think it could be.
Great, thanks so much. So now we'll come back to Michael, and for you, how are challenges like sophisticated disinformation campaigns, legislative pressures, or self-censorship impacting the day-to-day work of libraries and information professionals in your context?
Thank you. So it's a tripartite question. If you didn't get it, there's three things I'm going to address here, and I'll try to do it as succinctly as possible. Starting with disinformation campaigns, legislative pressures, and self-censorship. To start with, I think we need to acknowledge that this sort of coordinated library resistance movement that we are experiencing right now is driven by a coordinated disinformation campaign, specifically about that is malicious towards the LGBTQ plus community. And earlier today, Jim Turk touched on this organization, Action for Canada, that has been the most organization driving this movement. I want to just very politely correct Jim on one point. They did not start during COVID. They actually started before COVID, and they started explicitly as a Christian nationalist organization. When COVID hit, they started pushing COVID-related conspiracy theories, which algorithmically spread like wildfire, and gained them a much, much larger, broader, more diverse audience than they had before. Once COVID started settling down, they began to push this anti-LGBTQ rhetoric. And if we look at the shape of library challenges that we've received in the past 10-year period, we see that the spike happened a little bit in 2022, but a huge spike in 2023, right as soon as all of the COVID-related restrictions began to be lifted. They changed their tactics immediately and attacked libraries specifically for the inclusion of LGBTQ plus materials and programming. And this is all driven by this absolutely false rhetoric that LGBTQ plus people, the mere existence of LGBTQ plus people and resources is in some way going to harm children. So that is kind of the background information that's necessary to have when we talk about how disinformation campaign has affected library workers. All of the struggles related to intellectual freedom, or well, the great bulk of the struggles that we're dealing with in intellectual freedom in libraries stem from this one concerted disinformation campaign. And to give you a little bit of background context to that, we have been, between the CFLA and the CFE, we have been tracking library censorship efforts and have accumulated over 20 years of data on this topic. Between, for like the 6 or 7 years prior to 2022, prior to, right before COVID and then the first 2 years of COVID, library challenges to LGBTQ themed materials consisted of maybe 8% of our total challenges. Challenges to materials that were deemed homophobic or transphobic generally outnumbered challenges of the first nature. But if we graph a chart of the proportion of challenges for each challenge reason, in 2023, we see that pretty much all categories remain stable or dropped a little bit, but the numbers for challenges to LGBTQ plus materials went from 8% of our total challenges to 38% of our total challenges, and then by the end of the year went up over 40%. So it is specifically to this one issue, and it has changed the landscape of library censorship by a huge amount. So I'm going to move on to legislative pressures now. As I mentioned in my answer to my first question, that the way that political entities have taken advantage of this populist rhetoric that has that's been quite influential, it has been very disturbing. And I talked a little bit about the Alberta Education Act, and I just want to stress that this really strips library workers of the ability to curate a well-rounded collection, and it also affects teachers because they're no longer able to teach the way that they want to. They can't they have to follow a certain curriculum, and you can't stray off of that curriculum if it's not ministry approved. And so if we're not able to teach our children anything outside of a pre-approved set of subjects that is designed with political motivations, what are we doing in education? That is not an education. From a public library standpoint, the institution of or the passing of actually it wasn't even the passing, when that act was proposed in early 2024, the Library Association of Alberta released a letter to the Alberta government citing their concerns with this and how it violates the intellectual freedom rights of the children. And as a result of that letter, the library boards of several rural libraries in Alberta opted to cancel their membership in the Library Association of Alberta. These were not librarians. These were not library workers. These were the boards. These were the political entities that govern these libraries who made that decision. And that's from a provincial standpoint. We also have concerns from a municipal standpoint. And this has been publicized fairly well recently from a CBC Fifth Estate piece called The Shadow War on Libraries that focused in on what happened in, again, Alberta is going under the microscope here, but what happened in the small town of Valley View. The Valley View Public Library came under attack from the municipal government, lost their library location, had to get forced to share space with a public school, which then in turn affected what they were able to do for programming and collections. The library workers there attributed this to retributive action from the municipal government and from a certain portion of the population because the library was hosting a teen gay straight alliance group. Now, the municipal government was able to do this without directly addressing the issue that the library thought was the cause of this by, sticking with plausible deniability and just saying, well, we just don't have the budget for doing this. Meanwhile, increasing budgets for their own pet projects, as what typically happens in these sorts of situations. And I also want to take a moment to just address some of the short-sighted measures that we've seen from the federal government in this. And I'm going to speak specifically to one point here. An issue that has not been brought up, but an issue that's very near and dear to my heart, is accessibility. When we talk about access to information, we're talking about access to information for everyone. And as Joseph mentioned earlier, I'm the librarian for the Provincial School for the Blind. access to information for everyone means access to information for people who are not sighted as well. Our previous Liberal government, headed by Justin Trudeau, passed the Accessible Canada Act a few years ago. But then last year, changed the funding model that provided funding for CELA and NELS, which are the two resources that provide accessible resources for, two organizations that provide accessible resources for low vision and non-sighted students in Canada, or people, not even students. So whilst giving lip service to accessibility by cutting the funding to accessible resources, students and people with visual disabilities are losing their theoretically inalienable human rights to information because we do not have the courage to fund these projects that provide information to people who need them. So we're looking at legislative issues from a variety of different sources here. And then, I'm sorry, I'm going over, but we have three things to address here. The last thing I want to talk about, again, is the issue of self-censorship and how that is manifested in public libraries with the canceling of drag story times, taking down pride displays. I want us to really think about how we're using the term self-censorship and what that implies, because I don't want us to think that libraries are doing this for ideological reasons or democratic reasons or out of appeasement. They're doing it out of safety. I've spoken, because I've had this opportunity to chair the Intellectual Freedom Committee, I've been able to reach out to libraries across the country, have conversations with individual librarians who've been facing these issues in their various libraries, and had conversations about why this library canceled their drag story time or why they're not doing Pride programming this year. And it comes down to patron and staff security and psychological and physical safety. We had a library, a rural library system in Ontario that I spoke with, who had very, very successful drag storytime hours for a couple of years. But then the previous year, they were faced with such vitriolic protests that their library workers were getting called out on the street in their communities, being called sexual predators, being called pedophiles, which is horrible for anybody. But there are a number of library workers in the system who are queer, and those terms are even more loaded if you are of that identity because of the sordid and shameful history of conflating LGBTQ plus identities with pedophilia. So these people are being derided in the most hurtful way imaginable within their own communities. And they're dealing with this walking down the street in their own homes. And library workers, we didn't get into this business to fight. We didn't come here to put our bodies and our own psychological safety on the line. So when libraries are canceling these programs, we can't think of it as censorship. We have to think of it as protecting themselves. And this is there's a level of empathy that goes into it, and we can't think of it as caving into the demands of these reactionary forces. We have to be more empathetic to the library workers that are suffering because of the situation that we're in. Now, I am confident that this will pass and we'll be able to have these programs again in our rural communities where I think the people need it the most. But that I am sure that time will come. I just hope it comes soon. So that's really the last point that I want to make on that note there.
Thanks so much, Michael. So we're going to go back to Lisa now. So how is increasing polarization in public discourse affecting libraries' ability to maintain neutrality and uphold intellectual freedom principles, particularly concerning collection development and programming at TPL?
Thanks, Joseph. I think, as I mentioned already, it's important to remember that when we think about intellectual freedom and neutrality, we also are thinking about its mutually reinforcing work that we do with equity. And so at Toronto Public Library, it really has validated the importance and the library's commitment to advocacy and work and practice of intellectual freedom. I'm going to start off by just sharing some of the work that we've done to create further transparency about the library's commitment. And we've also supported numerous libraries throughout Canada and North America, and actually internationally too, with the same kind of transparency work. So one, making it very evident at the highest level that we have an intellectual freedom statement, which sits on top of all of our policies and procedures. And then integrating that intellectual freedom into our system policies of programming, art displays, exhibits, material selection, and ensuring, again, that all of that's on the website for the public and all stakeholders and staff to see. Furthermore, providing transparency via our website of the request for reconsideration process, not just for materials or programs, but for events, for room bookings, for art displays. And then I think one of the most important things, and some libraries stop, on that last part of doing the request for reconsiderations, but it's that reporting, so that the work of the Center for Free Inspection and the Canadian Library Challenges Database, co-sponsored with CFLA, can clearly evidence the work of intellectual freedom and the challenges that libraries are facing, is just so important. And again, when we think about neutrality and transparency of the work that we're doing and continuing to respond to these challenges, all of those pieces are so important. It's not just having that stuff on paper, but then it's actually actioning it and reporting it to your board annually, ideally, and then regularly reporting the requests for reconsiderations also to a larger body, so that there can be national visibility on that, and then some of the great work that Michael's done with those reports as well. And of course, moving on to programming, huge shout out to James Turk and the Center for Free Expression, who have launched a national Center for Free Expression training. So like at the staff level, there's a great set of programming available for all libraries to use to understand what is intellectual freedom, why it's important, what the role of libraries is, and then how to actually practice it. And then again, thankfully, through the Center for Free Expression, there's ongoing support for libraries who do face challenges and need to work with the police to ensure that there is safety, so that events can continue whenever possible, and to work with boards to create a greater understanding of how to ensure that staff do feel safe and comfortable in their roles of protecting intellectual freedom and doing that work. Other programming things that we've done intentionally and purposely for our public to understand both neutrality and intellectual freedom at Toronto Public Library are things like physical book sanctuaries. So huge kudos to Chicago Public Library, who launched the book sanctuary movement. There's a couple of public libraries off the top of my head, like Ottawa and Calgary and Toronto, who have created physical book sanctuaries for people to neutrally access that passive programming to see why books are being challenged, what books are being challenged, and then be able to access that information as well. We also have What's at Stake programming that talks about a wide variety of topics that some may find controversial, but we bring together a variety of voices and viewpoints to inform the community and create a space for dialogue. And prior to those What's at Stake programming series, the staff here also hold civil discourse sessions where professional facilitators come in and help people talk about things that, again, sometimes are blowing up on social media, where there's anonymity or people are just able to share without having to listen. And so bringing people together to have those conversations. Another thing, too, that we've been empowered to do by the strong leadership that exists in Canada around intellectual freedom is we've hosted some nationwide streamed events for on intellectual freedom, specifically for library workers. And there's the ongoing incredible series, too, that happens with programming that we're proud to sponsor with CFE. And then the last thing that I'll talk about, which is I'm really proud of all the work that we're all doing, especially at TPL. But our Pride Alliance Committee, sorry, I'm just going to take a drink of water. Our Pride Alliance Committee at Toronto to be based on intellectual freedom. And I think that programming outside of the libraries, but with the library brand, with the bookmobile, at such a large event where sometimes there is a perception that that material is not always accessible or neutral, is just being so loudly, colorfully championed and shared with our staff and shared with our community. I think it's just a great thing to show that the library is a neutral place. And while the topics sometimes can be perceived as being very polarizing, we have such an opportunity in the environments that we work in to provide that neutrality, to provide a space for access, to provide a space for discourse, dialogue, understanding, and also provide an opportunity for people to experience something that if they are solely in their online silo or they were for not the neutrality and the breadth of services and the commitment to intellectual freedom that our libraries are able to provide. So thanks for that, and sorry for my voice.
No worries. Thanks so much. Well, before we get to the last question, I'm just going to interject with a plug here that we're working on a book for on censorship. Jonathan, Diane Cohn, and I are editing a book, and it's going to be called New Frontiers on Freedom of Expression, Global Perspectives on Censorship, and it's from the IFLA book series. And it's kind of interesting as we've been talking with the editors of the book series and looking at this and reflecting on what we're going to do, that this is the first time IFLA has published a book on censorship in the 188 books that have been published so far in that series. So I think it's about time, but it's also maybe scary that it is that time. And it's also interesting when we did the call for chapters, a lot of people said, oh, you'll only get stuff from the US. But Michael's reminded us that we had more challenges here in Canada per capita than in the US. And so maybe the sad thing is we had responses from all over the world. Now maybe there's some country, I mean, it's not all from the US. We've had from from Europe, from Australia, from New Zealand, from Africa, from India, from fanzines in Mexico to manga comics in Japan and North Korea. I mean, maybe some big exceptions might be China and Russia didn't, but you know, most of the places that you think of as the democratic places around the world are all found things to write to us about. We have more chapters than we could have possibly included, so it's been a challenge to figure out which ones will make it to the end. But that's something that we're working on for next year, and so it's just interesting in our times where we are with that and where that will go. So for the last question in this session, looking ahead 5-10 years, what is one key area where you believe libraries and organizations will need to innovate or adapt to effectively safeguard intellectual freedom? And so we'll go back again to Jonathan.
Thank you, Joseph. Well, this is also a little bit complex because I think that there is a need to evolve internally as professionals, but also in general as a profession. I mean, speaking about library profession. And this means, and we have heard this before, to upskilling ourselves and our staff in AI literacy, data ethics, and verification. Also, I think that it could be relevant to explore new services and to review our own ethical codes, to start thinking, to start discussing about if we need an update on our own national library code of ethics to perhaps address algorithm bias and privacy in this new context. I mean, for example, at IFLA FAIFE, early this year, we conducted a survey on the IFLA International Code of Ethics, and it was very wonderful to see that we had 91 responses for all over the world. And this was one of the most active survey from IFLA. I mean, imagine 91 responses. That reflects the importance of taking this issue seriously. And I have some key findings from the recent survey. For example, on awareness, there was a high awareness, nearly 75% of the people, they know the IFLA International Code of Ethics. They mentioned that all current themes are considered important, especially privacy and transparency. There was also a need for evolution. I mean, responded, highlighted shift since 2012. That was when IFLA launched the original IFLA International Code of Ethics. I mean, I know that it is young because, for example, other library association has their own code of ethics, like for many decades ago. For example, in Mexico, we have our professional code of ethics 40 years ago. It was launched 40 years ago, and now it is under another the first review. I mean, the current president is working under a new review of the IFLA Code of Ethics, and I know that Chile, I think, it's working also under a review of their own Code of Ethics. So there were a lot of considerations for a possible update of this Code of Ethics. There were suggestions that the Code of Ethics should include digital inclusion, environmental sustainability, social justice, and among other things. So this is for one side. And second, I think that we must strengthen our external advocacy. Libraries need to be a clear voice demanding transparency from tech platforms and participating in the creation of ethical AI governance. I mean, we've been saying this, for example, in the IFLA Libraries and Artificial Intelligence Manifesto. It was launched 4 years ago, if I recall. Maybe Maria should have the correct date. And of course, we must push for frameworks that protect information integrity. And it is all about proactively building our capacity and shaping the environment to ensure AI enhances rather than erodes. Of course, this is not an isolated work, because we need to work together with other organizations, with our government, etc. And I know that this is difficult because it is not always in the same context for every country.
Thank you. And so now we'll go back to Maria, and I should say we're down to like the last 8 minutes, just so the speakers know. Each of you has just 2 or 3 minutes to speak.
Thank you, Joseph. So, well, I think I agree with Jonathan. I also think it's a very complex question, but I think maybe if I had to pick perhaps one area that I think it is important to sort of for libraries to step up in terms of intellectual freedom and information integrity, perhaps I would pick digital privacy and anonymity. And well, the reason why I would pick that topic is because I do believe that if we want to protect intellectual freedom in a meaningful way over the next decade, I think this is something that we really need to sort of step up or work more in. I also say it from the IFLA side, because today there's a lot of things we do online that leave a big digital footprint. Our searches, for example, the websites we visit, even harmless. In some parts of the world, accessing certain information either on politics, gender, history, human rights can actually put people in danger, which is some of what the other speakers mentioned when they talk about how in countries perhaps with strong protections, people are starting to maybe even self-censor. Has done some work, but I also think libraries can really lead in the conversation in the coming years. I think also libraries have always had this strong tradition of protecting reader privacy, and of course this has changed through time. But yeah, I think this could also mean things that perhaps could be useful in the coming years would be perhaps using platforms maybe that don't harvest user data or share it maybe with third parties, maybe offering privacy respecting tools and secure internet access in public library spaces. Of course, there's a lot of training or capacity building that comes with this. The part of teaching people how to use encryption, how to avoid surveillance, how to control these digital footprints, but also, and very importantly, to keep speaking out when there are policies that threaten these rights, whether it is because due to authoritarian state or non-state actors. And so I think it is about a lot more than just technology. It's also about trust. And I believe that if people don't feel really safe enough exploring or questioning or learning freely, then intellectual freedom is really already compromised. So I think this is something very important that I want to highlight. And also for the work of IFLA, I think from our side, we also think if we want to continue also leading the conversation and perhaps also being perceived as safe havens for open access to knowledge, we do need to make privacy and digital safety a core part of what we do.
Thank you. We're back to Michael.
Thank you. I'm going to answer this question a little bit differently. And instead of talking about what libraries can do, I want to talk about what library associations can do. This is really relates to my pet project working for the CFLA, is that I think library associations can have to adapt to the kind of world of data that we live in and do a better job at data collection and data analysis among their libraries. And the reason why is because after we started making a much more concerted effort at talking about and analyzing our data and creating data visualizations, showing the rise of challenges, showing the nature of challenges that have risen in Canada, we've been able to create these information products that we've been able to supply to the media, we've been able to supply to politicians that can help to spread our message to fight this complacency that I was talking about beforehand, and show people outside the library world empirically that the problems that we're talking about are a big issue and that they are threatening a certain group of people. And if we are able to do a better job at data collection and data analysis and providing this empirical evidence of the struggles that we are facing, we are able to advocate for our libraries better, and we are able to advocate to the people who are affected most by these sorts of reactionary movements better. And this does not necessarily apply only to censorship efforts. Library associations can do a better job at data collection and data analysis in a lot of different areas to help improve the way libraries are funded and the way that libraries operate within their countries. And for the CFLA, because we are not an organization of libraries, we are a federation of library organizations, the best we can do is really just advocacy. So having this information available to us has helped us advocate to the absolutely highest levels at provincial and federal governments talking about our issues. Now, there have been certain governments and certain portions of governments who have been completely unaccepting of anything that we have ever sent to them. But we have had Liberal and NDP MPs at the federal and provincial levels cite our research publicly in social media posts, in statements, to address the issue with libraries, specifically during Freedom to Read Week. So it has made a difference, and I think we can continue to make this difference. And so what libraries can do is make sure that they are providing this information to their library organizations. As Jim Turk said earlier today, the ALA estimates that only between 5 and 18% of challenges and libraries actually get reported to the ALA. And a couple of years ago, myself and another member of the Intellectual Freedom Committee did some survey research in Canada and found that we probably have right about the same rate. So even though we've had this massive rise in challenge, that's only a drop in the bucket compared to what we actually have. So if libraries can work to provide this information to us, we are able to address the issues that are facing libraries more effectively. And one last thing I want to point out here is we have no idea what is happening in academic libraries. And I know there are a lot of academic librarians here. We get plenty of public reports, we get a fair amount of school reports, and those are growing. But academic libraries very rarely actually report any sort of intellectual freedom issues to the CFLA, and very rarely do they to the ALA either. If you are interested in sharing what is happening in your academic library in regards to intellectual freedom, go to the CLCD and file some reports. And also, there is some very important research going on right now, being done by two researchers at the University of Toronto Libraries, Kate McDonald and Courtney Lundgren, who are right now doing a research survey specifically on the issues of academic freedom in intellectual freedom in academic libraries. If anybody wants information on that, see me. I will get you a link to that survey. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. And finally, we are back to Lisa for the last word.
Thanks. I think validating what everybody else has said, I think just the continued intentional and purposeful championing of intellectual freedom is so important. Kudos to Buffalo Public Library, who launched their new statement of purpose yesterday with a strong focus on intellectual freedom. And I think locally, having shared definitions of intellectual freedom, whether it's in your municipality, in your province, so that we can advocate and work together and support each other. we're stronger together in everything that we do. And so if we can do that, and I'll just end off by saying, I can't say, emphasize enough how important that reporting is. We need to have accurate stories, and those stories are going to come from our data. You can spin anything, but if we have that reported data, it just strengthens our ability to create the change that's needed to further strengthen our commitment and our resolutions to the importance of intellectual freedom. So again, thanks, Joseph, for the opportunity, and to York for the session today.
Well, thank you, Lisa, and thanks to all the panelists. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you.